A new global index reveals that 9 out of 10 countries worldwide are pursuing policies that are likely to increase levels of economic inequality. According to the report published by Oxfam and Development Finance International, 94% of African countries with current World Bank and IMF loans have cut vital investments in education, health and social protection over the past 2 years. CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy reports.
A staggering 44 African countries are reportedly slashing crucial investments in education, health and social protection. The drastic financial shift is being attributed to the stringent conditions tied to loans from global financial institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank. According to the Oxfam report titled Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index Report 2024, inequality is reportedly high or increasing in 54% of countries that receive funds from International Development Association, the World Bank's concessional arm for the poorest nations.
It's unthinkable that at this very moment when we should be recovering and governments are cutting back. And part of it has to do with the poor advice from major institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And remember, many of our countries have turned to these institutions because of the debt crisis.
Despite significant financial inflows, the anticipated equitable growth is said to be faltering. IDA funds are designed to support social programs and infrastructure development. According to Oxfam, a significant portion of these funds isn't translating into reduced inequality across the board.
I mean, the picture shows that it's not a good sight, and that if with just 6 years to the end of the structural adjustments, if we do not do anything, actually we'll be worsening the state of inequality around the world.
The report shows that 9 out of 10 African governments under study backslid across one or more critical areas since 2022. The Central African Republic, for example, cut its investment in health, even though only a third of the country's population is covered by essential health services. Besides cutting investments in education, health and social protection, 4 out of 5 African countries have weakened their tax system's ability to reduce inequality. Labor rights and minimum wages are reported to have worsened. 7 African countries, Burundi, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda and Zimbabwe, have no minimum wage or have not updated it for more than 20 years. The report urges governments to commit to mobilize domestic revenue through progressive taxation in order to reduce widening inequality. Daniel Arap-Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, earlier we discussed this report with Hannah Ryder, the CEO of Development Reimagined, an organization that specializes in China-Africa policies and helps African businesses expand in China and vice versa. She joined us from Washington, and we began by asking her why rising debt is forcing African nations to cut spending in key sectors and what countries can do to cushion the public sector from the pressure of external lenders.
Well, I think it's obviously alarming at this point. You know, we've come out of COVID-19, we're meant to be having an economic recovery, and to be honest, many countries need to be moving and growing, and to have the idea that we do not have enough finance, that it's the taxpayers in the poorest countries that need to be paying in order for that economic growth is obviously very, very difficult. And that's what the inequality means. It means there's actions, the sorts of policies that are being talked about are things like, you know, the increase of fuel prices, the increase of the reduction of subsidies on food and so on. And this affects the poorest in our countries. And that's something that really should change, and that obviously the reason why this report has been put out at this point is the IMF and World Bank meetings. And so I think, you know, the direct line between a World Bank loan and or an IMF loan and these sorts of reductions, it's hard to draw that direct line. But at the same time, we know, for example, like for example in Kenya, where I'm from, we've had, you know, when we introduced a new IMF program, that there were significant changes in proposed in terms of where the finance would come from for increasing tax in the country. So these are the sorts of programs and conditions that come with IMF and also World Bank lending, that, again, a reason for discussing this at this point is for African governments to say, we are no longer happy with the situation. We don't want to have more conditions on the kinds of, when we do borrow. It is our taxpayers who are going to be paying back in the end because we're borrowing. So we need much more autonomy, and we also need to be able to borrow at much cheaper rates so that we're not having to raise so much from our taxpayers. Yeah, well, certainly African governments in particular should be, at the very least, exchanging notes on how they have been able to get the most out of every single lender, and to exchange notes on how they've been able to reduce the conditions that come with the lending. And again, advocate internationally for these sorts of changes. At the same time, what they also need is more decision-making in the IMF and the World Bank, more decision-making power. It's not just about the number of African seats on the boards in the IMF and the World Bank. It's also about how many shares, how many quotas do we have, and we need the African governments certainly need to be trying to get more votes and shares on these institutions in order to influence them in the right way.